Hello everyone, my name is Aaron Christensen. This is Horror 101 with Dr. AC, celebrating classic horror throughout history with new episodes every Friday night. When celebrated author Paul Sheldon, played by James Caan, suffers an accident off of the winding Colorado mountain road, he is rescued by his number one fan, Annie Wilkes, played by Kathy Bates, who brings him to her remote farmhouse to recover. But as the days stretch into weeks, it becomes increasingly clear that not only is Annie a little unbalanced, she has no intention of ever letting him free. With screenwriter William Goldman adapting Stephen King's bestseller, director Rob Reiner and cinematographer Barry Sonnenfeld crank up the suspense and thrills with imaginative camera angles and editing. Bates and Caan are exceedingly well matched in their dynamic game of cat and mouse, and the instantly famous Hobbling Scene still retains its impact 35 years later. Here comes Misery.
You almost died. You have a compound fracture of the tibia in both legs, and the fibula in the right leg is fractured too. And as soon as the road's open, I'll take you to a hospital. In the meantime, you've got a lot of recovering to do.
There is nothing to worry about. You're gonna be just fine. I'm your number one fan.
My name is Annie Wilkes.
I think one of my clients, Paul Sheldon, might be in some kind of trouble.
You mean Paul Sheldon, the writer? Well, everybody sure likes those misery books.
They had it at the store, Paul.
They said he checked out last Tuesday. Isn't that a little strange?
I guess it was kind of a miracle you finding me.
In a way, I was following you.
You were following me.
Oh, Paul, I've read everything of yours, but the misery novels.
You must be a good man, or you could never have created such a wondrous, loving creature as Misery Chastain.
You're very kind.
The presumption must now be that Paul Sheldon is dead.
You dirty bird. How could you? Misery Chastain cannot be dead.
Misery Spirit is still alive.
I don't want her spirit! I want her! And you murdered her!
You don't think he's dead, do you?
And don't even think about anybody coming for you, because I never called them. Nobody knows you're here. And you better hope nothing happens to me. Because if I die, you die. I know you've been out. Is this what you're looking for? Eventually, you'll come to accept the idea of being here.
Annie, whatever you're thinking about doing, please don't do it. Annie, for God's...
Shh, darling. Trust me.
God's sake.
It's for the best. God, I love you.
Who's in the mood for a really good read? We're going to be talking about Misery, celebrating its 35th anniversary, and we've got an awesome panel to chat about it with me. Let's bring everybody in, and let's say hello to Dodd Alley.
Thank you for having me, Aaron. I'm your number one fan.
Jess Ader.
Surf's up.
That's a first. Jordy Sirken.
Hello, thanks for having me.
And Freddie Young.
Hello, you dirty birds.
And we are going to be chatting about Misery from 1990, celebrating its 35th anniversary. Thanks for coming on the show, everybody, and welcome. And just a heads up, we will be talking spoilers for both the 1990 film and the 1987 Stephen King novel. So just prepare yourselves, everybody. This is a film, came out in 1990, and for me, it was one of the, I had just moved from Colorado to Chicago, so I have a very strong memory of being in the theater. It was also the first date I had gone on with the first woman that I was dating in Chicago after my move. And it wasn't a great first date movie, but it wasn't as bad as when I took somebody to Fatal Attraction. So I feel like I was stepping up my game. Dodd, how did you come to this film for the first time?
On a prior episode, we talked about Gremlins and how I discovered that as a PG film I could find on video. By the time Misery came out, I was trying to take it to the next level and see R-rated films. And Misery came on, it was either Showtime or the Movie Channel. My parents would jump on these really good deals with analog cable channels at the time. I actually was very savvy and convinced my parents to allow me to watch it with them. And so it made a major impression on me back then. It was that and Silence of the Lambs and Martin Scorsese's Cape Fear all around that time. I think I saw them close together. So yeah, that was a really big rite of initiation for me.
Nice. Jess, how about you?
I was thinking hard about this, and the first knowledge I had of this was a panel in Cracked magazine. It was some whole thing about terrible scenes with feet, and it was Die Hard, this. So I just saw the hobbled thing, and it stuck in my head, and then at some point it was on like TNT or USA, and then I've come back to it a few times since. But I just freshly watched it for the first time in like 15 or 20 years, and it was still holds up quite well.
Jordy, thanks for coming on the show. It's the first time you've been on the show.
Yes.
Thank you so much for joining us. What is your origin story with Misery?
I think I was also trying to think really hard as to when my first experience was. I feel like I was far too young to have watched it, and it was just like flipping through cable and it being on like a TNT or something.
Yeah.
And me kind of knowing about the foot scene, just, word of mouth, but being far too young to probably watch it. So it was probably good that it was cable.
Thank you. And Freddie, we were talking backstage. You were just on our slashers panel where you had to watch, a dozen or so films. So thank you for taking the lighter load and just watching one movie this time around. What was your introduction to Misery?
Yeah, I also saw this in theaters when it came out. I was like 9 years old when I saw this. My mom just took me. She took me to any horror movie. So this was traumatizing. The foot scene. Yeah, I was like, never gonna be mean to women ever. If I'm writing something, you won't know how it ends. I'm just not gonna tell you anything. But yeah, I've always had a connection with this movie because my mom and I used to have a connection. We used to say "Hi, pumpkin" to each other. I did the middle finger, and she kind of go, "Oh, you're kidding," that's whole scene. So we always had a connection with that. She's not around anymore, so for me, it's like very personal. So we watched this, and it still holds up really well. I think Kathy Bates definitely deserved the Oscar. I guess we'll talk about that eventually. But yeah, just a great movie, great film adaptation.
Awesome. So this film came out in 1990, and it was based off the Stephen King 1987 novel. The story behind this film coming into production was that Rob Reiner's producer over at Castle Rock was apparently in a airport lobby, and he picked up Stephen King's Misery, which is in hardcover at the time, and he went and checked and see if anybody had purchased the rights for it. And it turns out nobody had picked it up yet. But that wasn't because it wasn't a good book. It was because Stephen King was not letting anybody pick it up. He wasn't that happy with a lot of the various adaptations that had come along. And so he was being a little personal with this one because it was a personal story. Paul Sheldon's an avatar for him, kind of working his way through.
I understand correctly that Stephen King was basing this novel on his experiences with fans. Having some pretty sharp criticism towards his work, and he kind of made this film. Of course, I also read that Annie Wilkes was sort of a reflection of a drug addiction problem he had at the time. Right, so there was also that. But if I understand correctly, it tied in with these sort of fans that were believing they had some sort of ownership over his material once he started to really hit the mainstream.
And he had just done a book that wasn't specifically horror. Because he started off as a horror writer, with Carrie and Salem's Lot and Dead Zone, things like that, The Shining. And then, he was starting to kind of veer away, explore other avenues. And there was some criticism about him trying to, or rather just saying that he should probably stay in his lane. That's very similar to what Paul Sheldon is dealing with, the character in the novel and later the movie, where he's writing this series of misery novels, these romance novels, but he also wants to write other things. And, the public is like, no, we just like the misery stuff.
I do remember while I was watching it thinking of the king of comedy, actually. There's a scene where Jerry Lewis is walking down the street, and this woman is like, will you talk to my friend on the phone? And as soon as he turns her down, she's like, I hope you rot in hell, and just shifts immediately. And so I thought a little bit about that and Sunset Boulevard as well. Just like two roles where there's some sympathy for these, in King of Comedy, for this talk show host who's expected to always be this thing and always polite and be the voice. The interesting part that I'm sure we'll get into as well is the casting wasn't originally meant for James Caan,
Right.
who's a very different type of person than Stephen King. But honestly, I like, clearly the star is Kathy Bates, but this watch around, I was like, this might be some of the best work I've seen James Caan do. In recent years, I saw Thief, and I just had this newfound love of James Caan, and he really plays himself much more down in this movie than usual. He's kind of a brute, and that still comes through a little bit, but it's interesting to see him as a more reactive character than he's forced to. He's like a guy who normally is like aggressive in his film, so it's interesting to see him have to be reserved, and it really shows his acting chops as well. He kind of is like the straight man to Kathy Bates really running the show. I thought it was interesting to juxtapose Stephen King versus James Caan and how different of personalities they are, but I think he did a pretty good job of making himself more reserved, and I don't think I appreciated that as much in prior watches.
Sure. And the basic story is that we have Paul Sheldon's a famous author, and he gets in a car accident on the way home after finishing his most recent book, which is not a misery novel. It is something that's, he's hoping that will take him in a different direction.
Right.
And Annie Wilkes, who is played in the film by Kathy Bates, saves him, brings him to her cabin, nurses him back to health, but there's a little bit of a price tag attached, as she says that she's his number one fan, and she also has certain expectations from him as a writer and later as a human being.
My first introduction to him was Elf.
He's great in that.
Very different role. So I was definitely intrigued by that, and his performance is probably the second movie I saw of his. So very interesting, very different. But no, I thought he was really great in this. I think there's like a calm demeanor that he has. He's very intelligent, but kind of manipulates her without her not, like behind the scenes to try to, find his escape, which I thought was kind of like a nice psychological aspect to the film. Like even the dinner scene really having to like play into, her fantasy of them potentially having a love connection, and him really, attempting to use that to his benefit. But I think overall it's just a very physically draining role. I would love to kind of watch some more behind the scenes. I never have, but I feel like, he's so sweaty in the whole movie, and you can feel the tension in his performance and the fear. So I do think it would be interesting to see this film with somebody else, because now it's just so iconic of a role of his. So interesting to know that like originally it was not meant for him, because I can't picture anybody else.
Yeah. Well, that is the thing with films, right? You don't hear about all the stuff, or at least, you never get to see Warren Beatty, in this role, because he was certainly one of the front runners. Freddie, how about you? What are your thoughts about Paul Sheldon?
Yeah, I agree. I think, he's playing against type. He's usually like the very gruff, aggressive, he's like mobster movies he was in, very like hitman movies. So to see him be very vulnerable in a role where he's like just the victim, and just his evolution as this weak man until like this very strong, psychologically challenging person. He's kind of matching wits with Annie by the end, is great. I'm sure he had a lot of fun doing this movie, because this is so not what he usually does in film. So it must have been just a joy for him to do that.
I will actually counter that, because this was not a joy for him.
Oh, okay.
Because he spent so much time in bed.
Oh, okay.
And he is a very physical actor, and he's a very intuitive actor. Kathy Bates, who we'll talk extensively about later, she was a stage actress, and so she was accustomed to a lot of rehearsal. This was one of her first film roles. And James Caan, on the other hand, he likes to read the script and then do the scene. He does not like to rehearse. He likes to just go into it. I remember an anecdote where he said, I read the script once, and then I say the line, and if the line isn't what was in the script, then the line was wrong. which I thought was super arrogant.
Like Dave Mamet style.
But I understand where he's coming from in terms of it needs to come from a place of truth for him. And so he was coming from it from that regard. So this was
but it's funny because his facial expression, his body language is so powerful in this movie.
Yes.
You would think like, you know, he's really like working the role, but I'm shocked that he's not like.
Well, the thing is, like, I think a lot of it is instinctual for him. He's very reactive.
Right.
And so, but yeah, I agree. This is a very different role from what we're used to seeing from James Caan. And I think
it's a lot more subtle. You know.
Well, and exactly, you see the wheels turning a lot. We get to spend a lot of time with him. There's on the commentary track, Rob Reiner talks about how when they moved from the room out into the hallway, like they'd moved like maybe 2 feet, but everybody's like, "Oh my God, thank God we're out of that room."
I noticed something just to kind of add on to the compliments for James Caan's performance. I noticed something. I've seen this movie multiple times, but when I watched it last week, it seems like there's a turning point where James Caan, he establishes himself as Paul Sheldon. And then once he realizes what he's getting into and what to expect with Annie Wilkes, I think it's around the time when she brings him the typewriter. He starts to play a different version of Paul Sheldon to appease her. His eyes become innocent and naive and doughy. and I noticed that just once again, just adding on to this nuanced performance of his. I mean, he not only has to be vulnerable, but he has to play this version of Paul Sheldon that has to walk on eggshells around this character.
Yeah, I think that's a great observation. And I think this Paul Sheldon is very different from the Paul Sheldon that we see in the novel. This is a more, you can tell, even though he is limited to the bed, he's still somebody who is masculine and physical and would like to be able to get out and do things. I mean, he goes up to the mountains of Colorado, you know, and I think there's something about that informs who this person is.
I think there's a bad version of this movie where his inner monologue is being sort of like the theatrical cut of Blade Runner. And I think that's why a lot of the adaptations of King suffer, because they so much inner monologue and character driven thoughts that you can really terribly do that, where just show us. And I think they did a really good job of, it's a very simple film, really, in rewatching it.
This is probably one of my favorite, if not my favorite, adaptation. William Goldman did the script, and Goldman is somebody who's a novelist as well as a screenwriter, and he really understands that the book cannot be the film. Right. And there are several significant differences between the book and the film, but I feel like he absolutely captures the spirit of the book, even though there are multiple events that are quite different. We never meet, you know, Buster and his wife, the sheriff. You know, we barely ever, I don't think we ever get into town. You know, we just spend all of our time in the room and around the farm.
Right. There's a lot gory also in the novel as well. Like the Hobbling Scene in this movie is just pretty much the vicious moment, but in the novel, like he gets amputated multiple times. Like he's psychologically tortured. Like you have the inner monologue in the novel, like he's like going crazy.
It was Rob Reiner's decision to do Hobbling instead, because he thought then Kathy Bates would be much more, you could still see her as a human and not a complete murderer. Full circle to Fatal Attraction, which is hilarious because those two movies, they're kind of a double feature well together, but Glenn Close played it as someone with a borderline personality because she saw it as a character who you could feel some sympathy for. And with Kathy Bates too, you're like, there's something more to this person than she's just insane or whatever. It's much more complicated. So I think the choice to not ever sever his feet off is ultimately the better choice, and it's just as memorable.
I think the Hobbling is actually worse than the adaptation because more just torture. You know, she's like, she has this power over him. Like, I can do this to you whenever I want.
Yeah, and he was so close to healing.
Right. So you just cut a foot off. That's okay. Whatever, you can bleed out. Whatever happens, but like this power, that's what she wants over this guy. Like, I want you to finish this story for me. we'll just kill each other or whatever.
It's done in daylight.
Right.
Yep.
Which makes it so much more terrifying.
Jordy, did you say you had seen the Hobbling Scene before you saw the film?
No, I heard about it.
Okay.
So I had an expectation of like, oh my God, this is going to be the most horrifying thing that I'll witness. And I feel like it was definitely edited on TV. It's not as clear what was going on. But I think like that was a good point, Jess, that you made about how I do feel like in this film, Kathy Bates plays it where you kind of do have to have a little bit of sympathy for her. Like, that she's in the wrong and what she's doing is horrific, but she is so good at playing it back and forth of like, you're very afraid of her and you're like, this woman is insane. But then you kind of do empathize with her and she's just a lonely woman. And maybe she's had a really horrible life that's gotten her to this point. So it's an interesting watch when you're kind of like going back and forth with the villain, trying to meet them where they may be, because they might not be totally evil, but in the end, yeah, she was kind of.
Yeah, and that's what I was saying about the Glenn Close borderline personality is there's moments of Kathy Bates' character. Annie has moments of clarity. It's like, oh, my sinus is clear. Oh, it's stuffed up again. And there are those moments of humility. It's just, it keeps getting shorter and shorter, those periods of time of clarity, basically.
Well, let's talk about Kathy Bates. She was somebody who was a new face. And that was something that Rob Reiner had in mind. Paul Sheldon is a famous person. So he wanted to have a famous person in the role of Paul Sheldon. And Annie Wilkes is a nobody. She's just a regular person. And so that's why it was great to have a fresh face that you didn't have any expectations from. William Goldman talks about the fact that, in that scene where she's asking him to burn his book, after she does the dousing of the lighter fluid, she then starts casually, while she's talking, throwing the lighter fluid on his bed. If you had an established movie star, we know they're not going to set Jimmy Caan on fire. However, this new person, we don't know what she's capable of. And they felt that really upped the stakes.
Kathy Bates, I mean, even though I was pretty young, if I had been watching films before, I probably would not have seen her or anything. Like you mentioned, Aaron, she had some bit parts in some movies leading up to that, I think, but she was mostly theater. It is good to see, though, because, I mean, this is really what established for me, the big first Kathy Bates performance that I saw, this reactionary, scary person. Her career after that she was never typecast as these psychotic characters. And I like that about her career, because it seems like since then she's played a lot of endearing characters, almost kind of like maternal like. And I'm happy for her that's, that she didn't get typecast as these very reactionary psychopaths after this film. But that was my introduction to Kathy Bates, and she scared the shit out of me.
Yeah, same. I think she's just a wonderful actress. It's funny because I watched Dick Tracy like a year ago, and she's in that movie. She's like the best friend of the female lead. So I was like, oh wow, I didn't realize she was in that. But yeah, very dynamic actress. Done so many different things. She's Matlock now. That's crazy to me. Like, doing that, and she's getting like awards for that. So it's like just to see her like go from this to what she is now is just amazing. Like, you would think like she'd be typecast for the rest of her life, but no, she's done everything: comedies, horror, dramas. No, it's great. She's wonderful.
My intro to Kathy Bates was my favorite movie, Titanic.
Yeah, she's right. She's in
Molly
that.
Brown. So yeah. I've always like had a soft spot for Kathy Bates. So seeing this movie though, after knowing her as so many endearing characters and just like a little bit lighthearted films or whatnot is very, very different. But I do think that her being a theater actor really helps, because I've seen people kind of complain that her performance in this can be a little bit like over the top at times. But I definitely think it reads as like a theater performer. But I think that works because back to our conversation of how this person, might be struggling with something. I think you kind of have to have those highs and lows and those extremes that you get from a theater performer. I loved it.
Kathy Bates, 5 stars, all the things all of you said, that. And then my thought about it was her role I watched About Schmidt again this last year. Interesting that it's like the flip side of the coin. Jack Nicholson's character is stuck in bed, and she's like this old hippie lady, and he's like, I I need to get out of here, and he feels like he's in her clutches. So I've never read or I didn't like research it, but I have to think that Alexander Payne somewhat knew what he was doing when casting Kathy Bates, because it was such a specific role and character. I have a whole new respect, I think, again, after not seeing Misery in so long and then seeing some of her other work more recently that were a little more modern than that. Yeah, she just always knocks it out of the park, whether it's a brief role in Rat Race or any number of films, but she never isn't a joy to watch.
And the movie version of Annie Wilkes is very different than the book version. The book version, she's a monster kind of from the get-go.
Yeah.
When you meet her, she already is unhinged. Paul, I think within like the first or second page, is like going, he knew he was in trouble. We don't get that. We get lured in. We actually come to really like Annie until we start to see, oh, there's not everything is strapped down perhaps as tightly as it should.
I think it starts with the rant about the cursing, right? Isn't that kind of where we get our first taste?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that the movie's like a slow burn. You know, you'll know what's going on, and then when she snaps at that moment you talked about, it's like, oh, okay. Like you're like Paul, like, oh, I gotta get the hell out of here. This woman's crazy. She's bipolar. Something's going on with this woman.
It's playing with that idea of her. And then, of course, later on in the film, you realize she not only has a few loose bulbs rolling around, but she's done some pretty awful things in her life leading up to this. And
it's
that
sort of like a nun. There's some small classroom nun energy for sure.
I know that she slips in I was the witness stand part of the movie, like he's like, wait, witness stand? Like you were in court? Like what?
I never noticed that till I watched it recently, where she it's that really quick line she just threw in there about the witness stand. I'm like, oh,
your anxiety goes right up. Like, oh, nope, I'm out.
Paul discovers she has a scrapbook, basically, and it starts off, it's hinted at she may have even killed her own father. When another student is going to get top honors in medical school, that student meets with an untimely end, and suddenly Annie Wilkes is getting top honors, and she takes over, the maternity ward at the hospital, and then children start dying. And I think right around then you're like, Annie Wilkes is not a good person, and she's murdering children. And the fact that she can still be kind of endearing and lovable and this kind of horror icon after all of these years is pretty impressive. A lot of that, I think, goes to the hobbling scene. She smashes his ankle with the sledgehammer, and then it zooms in close to her face, and she says, "God, I love you." And you just go, yep, this is all coming from love. This is
I
all
laughed out
coming from
loud
love.
this time. I was like, this is quite hilarious. And I forgot about that. Yes.
I think the hobbling scene was part of what hooked me when I was obsessed with trying to see this film for the first time. It was the television ads. And at the end of the ad, she'd hold up the sledgehammer and say, "Trust me, darling, it's for the best." And then and it would break away. And I always wondered, what did she do?
Now, in the book, as Freddie alluded, his foot is amputated. That was a big source of contention because that hobbling scene in the book was what made William Goldman want to do the adaptation. And that was what allowed Stephen King to say, okay, if Rob Reiner directs it, because Rob Reiner had directed Stand By Me, which was one of the, better adaptations. And if William Goldman, Oscar-winning William Goldman, is going to do the screenplay, I will let you have the rights. And so William Goldman is like, that scene in the novel is something I'd never even imagined before, and it's going to be brilliant. It's going to make an iconic moment in a movie, and that's why I'll do it. And so he did. He wrote the script. In his script, she cuts off the foot. She, axes it. I think it was Rob Reiner who decided, you know what, that's just too much, and we're going to do the sledgehammer instead. And they had KNB, good old Howard Berger, Greg Nicotero, and Robert Kurtzman doing the effects. And it's just that one thing where the foot goes sideways, but it's very effective. But Goldman saw that first cut of the film and he lost his mind. He was like, I cannot believe you've ruined this movie. You've taken what was special about it and you've sanitized it. And Goldman has since gone, I was absolutely wrong, because if you watch it with an audience, the reaction is so visceral, and it really, really works. Warren Beatty was the one who said, if we cut the guy's foot off, he is scarred for the rest of his life. If we just break the ankle, he can recover. He can be a whole person again. He's not scarred irreparably. That whole genesis around that moment that has become so important to the movie that it almost was something completely different. And I think if it had been her cutting off his foot, it might have gone too far, and it would not have been embraced by the mainstream.
Well, I think also, like, going into the end, he's definitely psychologically scarred. And I think having it just be that, his foot or his ankle's broken, it's kind of playing into that, his traumas like beneath the surface. And if he had, a foot cut off or something, it's obviously more apparent and people would see like, oh, this guy's been through something, but he kind of has to go through the rest of his life with the experience that he had. And most people will never know what he experienced. So I think that was a good choice to kind of play back into the psychological effects that he'll have.
Yeah, definitely cuts to the core of empathy. We all can understand pain. And so you don't have to think about you don't have to really think about it. It's very clear. And I think what actually makes it more effective is actually his reaction. He's almost like drooling. It's sort of like I remember there's a scene in Fight Club where they were talking about the original cut where he's like beating up the blonde dude, Jared Leto's character, and there was way more blood, and they said that the audience reactions were actually more visceral when they did the cut with people in the crowd around it, like, ooh. And I think I was really noticing that this time because it's such a few frames of the foot.
Yep. You don't even see the second ankle get broken.
Right.
You just see the one, which again speaks to that restraint. And I think that
the sound is enough.
Right.
In terms of what makes this film a horror film, it's just that scene and the situation. But mostly it's that scene of watching the ankle break.
It allows the audience to kind of sympathize with him, right? Like, you don't know what's going on. You're kind of in his shoes, like, what's going on here? Like, what onto the other ankle? And you're kind of feeling his pain through the screen. That's what makes it so effective. Like,
well, and the movie's so much more than the movie with the hobbled ankle.
Right.
Luckily, it didn't just become that.
Especially with everything before that, where she's kind of like, okay, she's kind of a little kooky, but she's not like a vicious person. And then when she does that, it's like the whole thing changes. Like
yeah, it's sort of like the alien popping out of the stomach.
Right.
It's like it's a memorable scene and great to get people asses in seats, but it's so much
effective.
Similarly, a movie about people in fear,
trauma,
and yeah, you like empathize with them.
About that scene, something that made it really effective for me is the fact that leading up to it, Paul Sheldon is stoned and he's loopy and he's smiling, and you watch the adrenaline slowly kick in as he realizes what's happening.
Yeah.
Jess, I'm glad you made that alien reference, because I think much like that film, what makes it work, yes, you have those moments, but it's the relationship between the characters. And we really get characters in this film, all the way up to, JT Walsh as the sheriff, as they're bringing the car up. I'm like, that's a great moment there, is watching that actor deliver that statement to the press. But you have the relationship between Richard Farnsworth and his wife. You have obviously Annie and Paul. Like, I really feel like these are some really well-drawn characters and dialogue that feels natural and lived in.
Well, that was kind of a big difference between the novel and the film, right? Well, and I think you maybe mentioned this earlier, Aaron. With Buster, he was not a character in the book. Law enforcement was represented by these sort of troopers that were killed that didn't really have much character depth. And I was reading that Buster was introduced into the film to sort of introduce us to a world that was outside of the claustrophobic room. And that was a really cool perspective. And of course, Richard Farnsworth is just, everybody wanted that guy to be his grandpa anytime he'd be in anything.
Well, there's no point to that character other than someone is a witness to this happening and gives James Caan's character a little bit of wiggle room to like not be, but they're constrained. But really, it's so much worse when you see the husband and wife like in love and have this kooky, almost Twin Peaksy relationship, and then only to see him get shot in the end. It sort of like the point I've heard about Indiana Jones is he actually doesn't save the day or do anything with the Ark. He closes his eyes at the end. The Nazis get the Ark. His mission actually fails. And so the only point of Farnsworth's character, because he found him, but he ultimately doesn't save him. It's that there's the heart aspect where you have some humanity and an outside world and a chance of an outside world that's livable and enjoyable and worth fighting to survive for, that there is goodness. And I think just that character's representation of goodness is totally worth having especially in a movie that's not that long.
Yeah.
It's almost like The Shining, with Dick Hallorann. He's like the hero you kind of believe is going to save the day, but he ends up getting killed like right away. That's what Buster's playing in this movie. It's kind of the same situation. They're in a house by themselves, and he's the outside force, and the outside force gets into the house and automatically gets killed.
Yep, and doesn't save the day at all. Like you're following, you're investing, you expect this heroic moment, and you don't get it at all.
Yeah.
Jordy, what was your thoughts about Buster and Richard Farnsworth?
I was inevitably heartbroken when he died. I really thought the whole time, I'm like, this guy's gonna save the day, like you were saying, he's like kind of playful, and him and his wife have this really cute banter. So you're like, he's not gonna die. Like, he's too likable. He was not the brightest investigative human, but you do love him. Like he's a good character. So when she shot him with that shotgun, it was like, you've got to be kidding me. Because at this point, I mean, there's no hope that,
the wine already spilled. What options does he have left?
Yeah, like at that point, he had tried everything that you think he could have to get out. So that was the final hope. I'm like, oh my God, wait, there's still more time left in the movie. I thought this was going to be the big, rescue, and they're both going to get her. But I think it was a good twist that you don't necessarily see coming if you're not familiar with like the book or anything. But yeah, I did love the character, even though I wish he would have been a better detective.
I feel like that's what makes his the end so much sweeter too. I think they're sort of purposely pulling in your heartstrings. Now you're like, now when he gets revenge, I don't feel as bad.
Yeah,
because now she's committed the ultimate. She killed a person we've only seen as a good person.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, Jordy, I am going to be like, so he figured it out. Like, how can you say he's not?
He did, but I was like, you've got to work faster, You
were impatient with him.
I was like, come on. Like, he's missing. There's a weird woman in town. Let's put the pieces together faster. I was like, come on. But no, I still loved him though.
I love his low key approach to it. I mean, I love his little thing with the rubber band and how kind of contemplative he is. And he's going to, he doesn't know where Paul Sheldon is. So he's going to read all the novels. And I'm like, that's okay,
And to be fair, it is a small town that has probably never had a murder.
It's like a Fargo aspect for sure.
Yeah. So like, you're not expecting someone to be being held captive with his ankles broken in a cabin. So it's definitely fair that he was kind of slightly aloof at times.
In the book, what we have is a police officer who is looking for Paul Sheldon show up. Paul breaks the window and calls out to him. And unfortunately, Annie Wilkes is riding her power mower at the time and just basically mows over the cop. And so that's what I was expecting, was something along those lines. So with the shot,
much schlockier.
It's very messy. Yeah, very, very messy in the novel. But I wasn't expecting the shotgun blast.
Great squib. That's a great squib. Terrible death, great squib.
Yeah.
But circling back around, we've mentioned some of the big moments. One of the other ones is the burning of the book. This is a new novel that he's written, and it's one that he is very proud of, and feels like it is going to take his career in a different direction, because I don't think we've mentioned this, but his last Misery novel is the one that murders the character of Misery. And so he has effectively brought that series to an end. And when Annie Wilkes reads the new manuscript and then reads Misery's Child, the last book, she is enraged, insists that he burn his new book and write a new Misery novel under her watchful eye.
At a canted angle.
And on a typewriter with no ends.
Honestly, that scene was probably the more horrifying moment for me. I just think as a writer, the amount of effort you put into work, especially a novel, and this being pre-days of having a floppy disk or any Google autosave, it's heartbreaking because he has to burn something that he's very proud of. And I think that goes back to kind of the manipulation that she has against him too. She knows that will hurt him more than anything. That like crushed my soul, that all of his work that he was really proud of just goes up in flames.
Yeah, I think that's like just an epitome of fan culture, right? Especially now, I think people just want the same thing over and over again from the same people, and it's like you do something different. Oh no, but you gotta go back to the way you were. You can't evolve as an artist, So I feel like as someone who writes them, also I go, oh my god, like that's my hard work. I took so much time to do this, and you just don't care for it, and it's just like it's heartbreaking. You're right. Like it's just like, who am I if I'm not this?
Just his expression, it's almost like he's watching the fire on the grill, watching a part of himself burn with the book.
Yeah, he's dying at that point, yeah.
My date was like, well, he can just write it again, right? And I was like,
not the
this
same.
is
Not the same.
clearly someone who is not a writer. Who doesn't.
Have you ever had a college paper crash the night before it's due?
Just put it in AI. It'll be fine.
Yeah.
Just bullet points.
I was also thinking like test screenings. Does that how like the directors feel, the filmmakers feel when they do test screenings and the fans go, "Oh no, we can't have that in the movie."
Yeah,
I kept thinking that like, oh,
I don't like how it makes me feel. It's like, well, if you're feeling sad about a thing that's supposed to be sad, you shouldn't laugh. You shouldn't be thinking it's hilarious.
14-year-old shouldn't tell me how to make my movie. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
because you're going to come back around to it when you're 20 and be like, why did you do that? That's lame. And that is something actually I've really enjoyed coming back around to this movie year after year and kind of just having different experiences of it, because when I saw it in the theater, again, having read the book and then having expectations of what it was going to be and having it be something different, I really enjoyed that. Kathy Bates is so likable and then so scary, and James Caan, he really is a worthy opponent. Annie Wilkes does not just roll over him. It is a game of chess between those two. And I love watching that play out. And I think it's really great to see how that is done, both from a directing standpoint, a writing standpoint, and an acting standpoint. One of the things we haven't talked about is the camera work. This was Barry Sonnenfeld, who was the cinematographer for the Coen brothers for their early films, and then later went on to have a successful directing career of his own. But he takes that claustrophobic room. I mean, he basically has the one room to work in. But we get to see a lot of that. I talked about the push in on Annie's face. I mean, she takes up the whole screen at times, and it's scary and oppressive. And I think, it's a way to make the visuals of this film that could have just been a stage play.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's a lot of I know there's the Sam Raimi connection to Blood Simple, where they were taking some Evil Dead, so it comes back around always. And I do appreciate that this has that kind of classic Hollywood, almost Hitchcock. Mm-hmm. There's lightning and thunder, and it just feels big. And something that I really appreciated this time around is it feels like a movie. It doesn't feel like a film, and there's something endearing about it because The Shining is a film, it's a cinematic thing, and with this it somehow feels like it was made for TV, even though it wasn't meant to. And I actually love that about it. It's comfortable in its own skin, and it looks great, but no matter how much restoration you do, it still feels like it was kind of made to be cut for cable a little bit, and not in a bad way, just easy to digest for what the topic is or what the subject is. a lot of, I mean, I remember my grandpa talking about this movie. People that normally wouldn't have maybe watched, they're not watching Evil Dead, but somehow this movie really struck a chord with people. Obviously, Kathy Bates won Best Actress, and I think it's a really good in-between film.
The cinematography felt, especially the close-ups you mentioned, they felt very textural to me. One scene in particular that really stood out for me was when he's trying to pick the lock. And in a lot of films, you get the sort of the long shot, and you see the person putting their shoulder up against the door, and you hear the click. In this case, my thumb and my forefinger were sweating as I'm watching this close-up of him trying to keep hold of this hairpin while he's trying to get through trying to pick the lock. So I don't know, it just felt very textural to me with the close-ups and seeing things and seeing those details.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I feel like Barry Sonnenfeld is shooting those close-ups as opposed to a second unit director, which is usually who they farm the inserts out to, right? You're going to be like, okay, we need a close-up of this on the floor, we need a close-up of this, we need a close-up of that. Clearly, Barry Sonnenfeld is doing the hairpin on the ground and the lock and the little penguin. It's all done with such care that this was not just, the second AD handling it.
It's very intimate, just the way it's handled. It feels very personal, and it feels like, especially during the Hobbling scene, like when it starts, like she's the close-up, he's kind of more far away, and then as the scene progresses, it changes.
Yeah,
and like instead of him having the power in the close-up, he has the fear. He has no power in that close-up, and she has all the power away. And at the end of the movie, when the dynamic changes, his power is when there's a lot of space behind him, and her power is gone when she has the close-up. So it's kind of very planned out very well, and it kind of makes you understand, like just by watching, going, I understand the dynamic of these two characters. What's going? There's change from that scene to this scene.
Yeah, they cut out all the fat.
Yeah,
and it's really tight for sure.
Rob Reiner's career, if we think about where this lands in his career,
it's so weird.
I was honestly shocked that he was the director of this. He's a man of many talents.
Well, he'd come from a comedy background, with All in the Family as an actor. And then he did, This Is Spinal Tap and The Sure Thing and Stand By Me, When Harry Met Sally, Princess Bride, and then this movie.
Yeah, it's that aspect kind of still blows me away. How he got the okay and why he wanted to take this on as a project.
Well, it's interesting because I was reading an interview with him, and they talked about how similar to Paul Sheldon feeling pigeonholed, like you can only do this one thing, you can only do comedy. And the second somebody tells an artist, they can only do the one thing, they're like, well, hang on, I want to try something else. And so he felt a connection to Paul Sheldon as well, thinking, I want to try something that isn't just comedy to see what I can do.
Did Rob Reiner ever do anything that you'd call a thriller after this? I mean, off the top of my head, I can't think of anything, but I may be missing something.
Yeah.
He had this, and then he had A Few Good Men, and then he did the movie North, and North just tanked so hard, and he never seemed to get his mojo back after that, which I was surprised that just one bomb, after that string of hits. You do this, you do A Few Good Men, you think, okay, this guy's earned his stripes and he's never going anywhere. And I looked at his filmography, and there are no big hits after A Few Good Men.
Here's a sit down with Albert Brooks, which is enjoyable, but it's not the same thing.
It's a cutthroat business, I guess. Once one fail, that's it, you're done.
He did talk about in that same interview that the fight scene between Jimmy Caan and Kathy Bates is the second one that he's Princess Bride's sword fight being the other.
Right.
But the finale of this film, I'm glad you mentioned Fatal Attraction, Jess, because there's a definite, we get where Alex in Fatal Attraction is coming from. She's not justified in the actions that she takes, but she's not the bad guy in this situation. She's, one half. There are two people at blame here.
Yeah, exactly.
That's not the case here. I mean, Annie Wilkes is an unfortunately disturbed soul.
Yeah.
But we still like her. And even when they're fighting it out at the end, when he delivers that final blow, like the audience cheered, but then we all kind of felt bad for cheering.
But you're like, you killed Farnsworth, so
Yeah.
Yeah.
She deserved it.
You also kind of feel bad because before that, he's kind of manipulating her feelings for him. So you kind of go, yeah, she deserves it, but at the same time, you go, yeah, I kind of feel bad because that's what she wants this whole time, and she doesn't get it at the end. So it's like, well, karma.
One other side thought, just while it popped into my head, the whole Lauren Bacall thing's a little strange. Like, why this old star for like this role? Not saying Lauren Bacall's not great, but it seemed like those scenes were a little bit hammed up for sure. I would say those
get
dated
Lauren
it
Bacall
the
for
most.
a day, so let's use her.
It felt a little bit like, here's the phones we use in this decade or this era. They didn't like deter me at all, but I did think they were a bit strange.
The fight scene made me think of a story that Jon Favreau once told, and Jon Favreau directed James Caan in Elf, as you mentioned earlier, Jordy. And they had some difficulty with James Caan on the set of that film. And on the scene where James Caan had to go off on Buddy Elf, they wanted to get him riled up. So Jon Favreau leaned into James Caan's ear and said, "You're fucking Sonny Corleone," and he blew up. And it made me think of that in this scene, because up until that point, James Caan plays it so restrained, and he's letting it all build up inside, and then boom, the typewriter comes down, and he's gonna kill her.
I think it was a really good climactic end too, and I think obviously there's a lot of symbolism in it with the typewriter being part of the fight. I think it was a great moment to see him kind of finally be forceful with his survival, as he's been very, playing it close and holding his cards close to his chest kind of vibe with his, attacks back to her. So I think just seeing him kind of let loose and let his rage take over, and in the end he won.
Yeah, it's certainly a release.
Yeah,
Finally, this is my scene. Now I get to have the stage. I've been patient enough. It's almost like he's a dry drunk the whole movie. Just like, I can't do anything. He finally gets his revenge, and there's some justice served to some degree, even though it's gruesome. It's also like kind of almost like an over-the-top fun ending, particularly when you see her head hit the typewriter, and it's like a weird model head.
Little bounce.
Like it gets to a little bit of schlock, but I think done in a way that's kind of fun and almost, that's like the most horror part of the film, probably.
Yeah,
that whole ending.
The fact that I think you're right, that it does kind of like reach a crescendo, that you're like, because that's what the audience wants at that point.
Right.
Similar to Fatal Attraction, like the audience really wanted her to die at that point, because she boiled that kid's bunny, and that's a bridge too far.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that, the fact that even before that, he's during the montage, he's using the typewriter to like lift weights to get the strength back. Almost as a way like, I'm going to use this to attack her. And I also love that he uses the metal pig because she named him Misery. Like Misery is killing her. It's like what she loved is what's going to end her. So,
well, and the fact that the movie is called Misery, like I just like that kind of, there's a wonderful blanket statement about this whole movie.
Yeah.
Who's going to go to Misery to have a good time?
Us weirdos.
The pig moment, Freddie, is actually one of my favorites, because when he does the initial conk to the side, Kathy Bates' reaction is one of surprise.
Yes.
And I think that's a very human, like when you stub your toe before the pain hits, you just like go, what just happened?
Right.
And then, the killing blow is almost like a stereotypical katang, and she falls. But like, I love that moment of her getting struck, because her hands kind of like fly up to her head, like, what just happened? Like
Mhm.
it doesn't even really register. I just think it's a really great choice as an actor.
It's almost she's surprised that he actually attacked her that way.
Mhm.
Like he's like insulted, like she's like insulted, like really, like you just did that to me, then kills him.
I've been so great to you.
Yeah, because in her mind, she nursed him
was.
back to health and
Yeah.
is his, number one cheerleader. And
All she
one
wants is to just for them to be in love together and live
Yeah.
together in their little
Right.
house. If you get on her good side, she's not so bad.
she loves the love
Liberace.
connection, and she loves Cheetos and Coca-Cola. Don't we all?
She's just like us.
Yeah.
When she pulled out that gun, you knew it was over. I mean,
Yeah.
it was like that whole scene is just fantastic. Just her being so depressed when the rain happens, and just like her psychological state at that point. Like, I keep thinking about I'm going to use this on myself. I'm like, right there, like there's no hope here.
That's
And
like
even-
a turning point for sure.
Right.
Even that is coming from a really romantic place.
Right. Yeah.
Like, like you and I should be together.
It's like Romeo and Juliet, kind of
Mhm.
like if I can't have you, no one else will. So,
Any other favorite moments that we haven't touched on yet?
Well, I just had a random thought. And once again, this is one of those never noticed it before and didn't think about it until now. So she has a shrine to Paul Sheldon in her house. I also noticed she has framed pictures of Liberace.
yes.
And so somewhere out there, there's an alternative movie where Liberace's in her bed. And I want to
Wow.
see that movie.
So she captures Liberace as well.
Yeah.
I love
I don't
that.
think Liberace. Well, I don't know. Maybe we're not giving Liberace his due. Maybe he would be a worthy opponent for her as well.
Have
Yeah.
you seen the Candelabra movie?
Yeah.
Oh, the Michael Douglas one.
Yes.
that love would have been very
That
one-sided.
version of
I'm sorry to say.
Liberace.
Yeah, very
Although
one-sided love.
Michael Douglas was considered for the role, right?
Yes.
Yes.
And
yeah.
Gene Hackman to
Gene
be
Hackman.
Oh, R.I.P.
timely.
Yeah.
Well,
Which-
and I'm glad because in terms of casting Paul Sheldon, they went through everybody. They went through Robert Redford, Harrison Ford, Richard Dreyfuss. They went through every person who could be considered, and all of them turned it down because they didn't want to be basically you're the supporting character. You know that Annie Wilkes is the big flashy character, the one that's going to get all the attention. And it did. I think James Caan does such great work, and I'm glad we talked about him first because I think he oftentimes gets forgotten because
Yeah, that's
Annie
what I was
Wilkes,
feeling this
Kathy
time.
Bates's interpretation is so impressive and memorable.
I think that although I like the idea of a Gene Hackman version, I think he's so Gene Hackman and has that like terse energy that I feel like it just wouldn't. I think the heart aspect maybe wouldn't have come across as well. But yeah, I think I was just surprised in general that James Caan had it in him to do a softer side, and I'm really glad that that's how it worked out. Just as Hollywood goes, what a happy accident.
You mentioned those names. I just can't see them playing this role. I just can't. Like, I just feel like it will be a totally different movie.
Yeah.
I feel like Kathy Bates probably would have been overshadowed.
Well,
by-
they might have
Mhm.
written it a little different,
Yeah, yeah.
while filling too,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
or
they were
different
also
editing
talking
for sure.
different star actresses, who because other actresses wanted to play this role. They recognized that it was a flashy part, but Rob Reiner was set on using somebody who wasn't a familiar face. And William Goldman had seen Kathy Bates on stage, and he said, "I'm writing this role for Kathy Bates." And Rob Reiner's like, "No, she's great. That's a great idea." So it was the right people at the right time. What's interesting is that this was later turned into a stage play that William
right.
Goldman.
It very much feels like a play.
And
Yeah.
it's just the two of them. It was on Broadway with Bruce Willis and Laurie Metcalf.
Ooh.
Oh man,
Wow.
should be very good.
I would have seen that.
Yeah, Metcalf
Remember that
would be
now.
amazing.
But it's been adapted several times. There's the William Goldman stage play, but there's also different adaptations that have been done. And, for a theater audience that's used to just being in the one room, I think it would play just fine.
Mhm.
But here, Goldman had the foresight to say, we really need to open this up. We need to get out of that room every once in a while, let people catch their breath, and then get back into it.
I think that's what separates it from a movie that multiple or more people can watch, because it makes it more palatable and a little more just, daytime movie-ish or nighttime movie-ish on cable. And I think it was for the better in the end, because it makes it a much more just kind of is. I know it sounds weird, but it's kind of fun despite it being a terrible situation.
Yeah.
It's like really just feels almost like I want to keep eating these chips. And there's something exciting about how is this going to finally unravel, because it's so tight, but you have a feeling it's going to go somewhere, but you have to wait.
One of the things that's in the book is that Paul Sheldon feels like Misery's Return, the book that he's writing under duress, is perhaps the best thing he's ever written. And he really has a great affection for it, because he did have to resurrect misery. And he had to do it fair. We didn't even talk about the whole getting out of the cockadoodie car, like Annie's rant about the cereals and playing fair, and that she forces Paul Sheldon to be fair. You can't just make something up. You had her in the ground. You got to get her out of the ground. And so as he's writing, he has a genuine appreciation for his own craft. Look at what I'm doing, this great work I'm doing. And so for him to burn it at the end, there's a cost to himself as well, I think.
It's ironic that she kind of relights his fire for writing in a way. She kind of motivates him back into that mode. Okay, I'm this artist. I could really do this stuff. I could write this fake novel and it'd be real good. And it's nothing to him. It's just second nature.
I like the process more than the final product kind of thing.
Right.
Well, Jordy and Freddie, actually, all of you are writers in some regard. Do you enjoy the act of writing itself, or do you like having written?
I think I like the act of writing.
Yeah.
But I have to be in the right mindset. There's some times where I'm kind of forced to write because, there's a deadline and I want to get this review out, and, I just kind of have to hone in. But if I feel really passionate about something, I definitely and have time, I definitely enjoy the process a lot more, so I can sit with it. And I like having time to correct my work and go back and read it multiple times and think, what else can I add? So I think any kind of art form, you go in waves. You have to be in the right mindset and have the right, surroundings to.
I have that with drawing and editing, where it's I realize it's a meditative practice for me, and to be nice to myself, I'm autodidactic. I'm not formally trained in anything. I just enjoy the process of doing it, and I'm not formally trained in anything. But as far as creative, it's a peaceful place for me for sure. But I would think having deadlines and things like that, where it's tied to your work, it's a little different. I have the joy of just doing things for fun.
Freddie?
Yeah, in the same way, I feel when you're passionate and motivated, it just flows out real easily. And when you have a deadline, someone tells you get to write this, get to write that, it's a pain. And it's just you're there for a week trying to figure out what to write. And by the end of it, you look at it, go, this is not even good, but that's what they want. So I'm just gonna give it to them.
It's the getting the ideas onto the page that I enjoy the most. I mean, the writing that I still do today is on social media, movie reviews for films that I go see, and there's a sort of weight of the ideas that it's on my brain, and so it feels good. Just that process of getting it out on the paper and being I can fix this up later. You
can fine tune.
That's the best part about it, just expressing yourself in your voice.
I don't really enjoy the act of writing itself. I like it. I compare it to exercise in that I'm glad to have worked out. The act of working out itself is not one that I necessarily love.
Yes.
I don't like being uncomfortable and sweaty and straining things. It's I like being when it's over and be like, whew, that was good.
Yeah, you feel good about yourself. Yeah,
I look back at what I've written and I go, I like what I did there. That was good stuff, but it was labor, getting there. And so there are times when I'll have a particular turn of phrase that tickles me, but by and large, I'm okay, I just hammer these words together so that they work and they communicate. I think that's the idea, is that I'm trying to communicate something and you're trying to find the right means to do that.
Yeah.
And that's why when my date said, well, just write it again, I'm like, you have no idea.
Like climbing a mountain.
Like, no.
I can't find all those footholds again.
That's a great, that's a great metaphor. Because you really are like, what's going to be the magic word that connects to the next word?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I have a little bit of a reflection question that's been weighing on me throughout this panel. The question is, when you look at the time we're living in now, where you have grown men on the internet complaining that their childhoods have been ruined because of a Ghostbusters remake, I guess my question is, could Misery work today? With social media and the technology that we have.
No, I honestly, that's what I thought when I rewatched it recently is, it's wild to think how much this film and book talk about like kind of toxic fandoms and how much your audience like expects from you as an artist, and how angry they can get. And I feel like it's interesting that this whole thing came to be before the age of the internet, where now it's so much more prevalent. But I feel like all of the themes are the same. It's just that, people are a bit more vocal and they don't need to capture you and hold them in your cabin. But I think, it's interesting to see how like in media now, everything's just so much more. There's a lot of anger behind it if something isn't perfect. Or even in television series, if the finale isn't good, like Dexter or How I Met Your Mother or Game of Thrones, all of them had really bad finales and people are like, it's ruined the entire show. And so it's interesting that, in this movie, it's same stuff.
Yeah, I feel like you could explore that. My fear would be someone would overly intellectualize it.
Mm-hmm.
What I like about this upon this watch is the simplicity and the pace of it. And I think there's a version where you could make it about, you could pull in political or religious. There's a little bit of that in there subtextually, but I think you could, but that's what I like about it. It gives you enough to think about, put your own thoughts to it, but you could overdo it and make it about overly conservative person or whatever, but it's like that's already kind of baked into it. So I don't know. I would be fearful of them like, we're going to make a 3-season show about this character. And I think that's something that in recent times gets difficult for me, where they're like, let's try to find out who this character really is. And it's like, well, that's similar to Alien. It's like, well, what's so enjoyable is we don't know, and we can fill in those gaps with our own mysteries.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree with that. When I rewatched it, I was thinking, why hasn't this been remade yet? Everything that Carrie been remade so many times, and Pet Sematary.
It would be very schlocky.
Right.
Yeah.
And I go, maybe if we remake it now, it'd be too on the nose. I feel like people just over-explain themselves, kind of like take a stance and become so politicalized, like people just be turned off by it. Like, okay, we can. Like, I'm not into this at all. So I feel like
I can see it.
Yeah, I feel like it wouldn't work now. I feel like we're so into this toxic fandom issue, like it'd be too much.
Well, what's interesting is on the DVD extras, they talk about they had like all these featurettes about stalkers.
Right.
It was like they actually sat down with like psychologists, and I'm like, is that what this movie is? It's
Well, she did say she was stalking him.
Right, exactly. And I was like going, but in my mind, she's like just kind of like sitting just outside and not like actually interacting with him, not making a connection with him. Like, she doesn't talk about having written fan letters to him or anything like that. But I think what you're talking about, Jess, is the idea of the ease with which you can leave a comment or, send a DM to somebody.
Well, you don't have cell phones and you don't have computers either. And that's like a huge aspect that you could try to make a movie, but then you have to set it in 1980 something.
Yeah, you have to.
Yeah.
It feels like it is kind of anchored to this time. Like you if you went beyond this,
the wireless towers are down.
But it would be a much different setup, I think. And everybody would be like, Paul Sheldon's, Twitter page is inactive.
Blocked.
Basically, yeah. No, they definitely should never remake this and modernize it.
There weren't, other than Family Feud, there weren't that many specific references to the time period that it was made to, which I thought was effective as well in keeping it still enjoyable and not totally cheesy.
Cool. Well, let's circle back around. Final thoughts on Misery, and thank you all so much for chiming in today. This was a great one to have watched, having seen it many times, and then to know that we were going to all get together and share our thoughts. This was great fun. Freddie, let's kick things off with you.
Yeah, I still think this is one of his best adaptations, Stephen King. And it's funny, like I said, I watched this when I was 9 in the theater, and I feel like as a 44-year-old, it hits me differently now. Like I understand Annie more as a person.
Yeah.
At 9, you go, oh, she's just an evil woman just attacking this poor man. Now you kind of go, it's a complex character behind this woman, and you kind of feel sorry for her. But at the same time, you go, she kind of deserves what she gets at the end. But you kind of feel bad that she got to that point in her life that she's doing this to this guy. So, and as a writer also, I go, I've had kind of like stalkers when I've written stuff, so I kind of understand that whole thing. So I go, this is not totally false. This could happen to anybody. So I go, so as an older person, I have more of a connection to it. But yeah, I still think it's a great movie. I still think it holds up. I can't believe it's 35 years.
Dodd, let's bounce up to you.
Yeah, I feel like, especially a film that I adore and I've seen many times, every time I see it, I peel away something new that, I really didn't think about before. And so for me, seeing it as a kid and the hype during the 90s, the early 90s when it came out, it was all about Kathy Bates. And then later on, she was recognized, Annie Wilkes was recognized by the AFI as one of the top villains. But for me, just like what we talked about closer to the top of the show, my big takeaway this time watching it was appreciating James Caan's performance. Just to go ahead and just revisit that one more time. It's just how nuanced it was, and how once you are done reflecting on how crazy over the top Kathy Bates is, and she's terrific, just to me, almost at times, it's almost like his performance was underappreciated when her performance is overshadowing his. So that's what I really appreciated this go around this time.
Jess?
I feel like I covered most of it. My nerd shit is I did think it was hilarious the amount of cottagecore and Twin Peaks tie-in and Farnsworth being in another Lynch film. And so that aspect kind of made it a little more endearing this time around too, just having those thoughts. But yeah, there's just an endearing quality to that outside of the house element that I really appreciated this time and thought gave it a sweetness. And I had a really fun time watching it. And I think it was like a perfect length. There wasn't any wiggle room in the best way. And I just thought it was really well crafted and really well acted. And I had a really good time watching it this go around.
And Jordy.
Yeah, I think, echo most of what everybody else has said, but I do think, the more you watch it and as time progresses, I think you grow to appreciate it a little bit more. And I think kind of what Jess was saying earlier is like, it's such a digestible film. And I think sometimes when you're talking to people about, the classics and older films, I think some people think that you're being a little arrogant with your recommendations, or you're trying to recommend something that's like, the perfect film. But I think that this one is something that is so digestible for all audiences. And I think that it has a lot of good themes. It's tight, it's thrilling, but I think you can just have fun with it too. You don't have to overthink it. And obviously you get some great performances. So it's just an all around good time. And I always like to hear if people think Annie is an empathetic character or not. So I love when people watch it. And so I can be like, what do you think?
Kind of circling back to Dodd's question, I don't know that I'd want a remake so much as I love the idea of seeing what other performers would do with it, just because Kathy Bates brings a Kathy Bates quality to it. And James Caan is a different Paul Sheldon than, Robert Redford or Warren Beatty. But I would love to see Robert Redford, Gene Hackman. I would love to see Gene Hackman. I would love to see those two dynamics play off of one another. And whenever you're seeing like a two-hander, and that's kind of why I'm excited about it, having a life on the stage, is that you do have the opportunity to kind of plug and play, because people are more forgiving in a stage production of having different actors take it over. There's something about putting it on film that gives it a permanence and a sense of don't ever touch this again. I'm really glad that we ended up with the performances that we ended up with, because I can live with them I don't mind taking that ride and be like, what would it have been like if Richard Dreyfuss had ended up in the bed?
Such a weird idea.
Yeah. Well, thank you all so much. Looking forward to having you all on again very soon. And until next time, keep searching, keep exploring, and keep sharing the scare.